ሻሻይ ምዕራፍ
Chapter 6 The Idea of Freedom. First, the philosophical concepts of freedom. Second, the purpose and values of freedom. 1. The concepts of freedom. The concept of freedom is an idea formed throughout history, dealing with multiple ideas of how it ought to be described. Freedom is inherently a social trait, considering human beings are social beings. The idea must come from some idea of what it means to be unfree, which would make it a relational concept. This means it can only be known when comparing the relationships between people and their relative abilities to act in self-directed ways. Chapter 6 The Idea of Freedom. Chapter 6 The Idea of Freedom. Freedom is often described as one's ability to be a self-rationalized being, a rational being who acts in accordance with its higher self. Another conception of freedom is the absence of external constraints or barriers, which may prevent an individual from acting in a particular manner. To understand what is meant by freedom, it is important to understand what it means to be a human being. What is consistent over this period of time is the dependence of the lower class of people on other higher classes of people for survival. Not only low-class people depend on the high class of people for survival, but the low class are also instrumental in service to the higher class development. It is this understanding that has led thinkers to conclude man is exploited by another man in society. The solution to this problem was to take the power out of the high class hands and place it in the hands of a central power of the people. This emphasizes the importance of societal control. The control society wields over people is important because social restrictions and coercion are fundamental in shaping the individual due to the social nature of humans. Generally, the idea of freedom is an ethical order, which is freedom of the absolute will. The term ethics may refer to the philosophical study of the concepts of moral right and wrong and moral good and bad, to any philosophical theory of what is morally right and wrong or morally good and bad, and to any system or code of moral rules, principles, or values. The last may be associated with particular religions, cultures, professions, or virtually any other group that is at least partly characterized by its moral outlook. Traditionally, ethics refer to the philosophical study of morality, the latter being a more or less systematic set of beliefs, usually held in common by a group, about how people should live. Ethics also refers to particular philosophical theories of morality. Ethics and morality are now used almost interchangeably in many contexts, but the name of the philosophical study remains ethics. Ethics could be studied as a social, psychological, or historical phenomenon, but in that case, it would be an object of social scientific study, not a social science in itself. As the philosophical study of moral concepts, ethics is a branch of philosophy, not of social science. The ethical order is what is objective, a circle of necessity whose moments are the ethical powers that regulate the lives of individuals. Individual human beings need liberation to satisfy their dignity. Liberating people means to transform society to meet their needs. It actively opposes social injustice, inequality, and corruption. It is free from oppression, exploitation, and corruption. It is the ability to take charge and become self-reliant. People gain more control over their lives. Liberty is freedom itself. Liberation is the process, that act of setting something free or becoming free. It is the noun form of the verb to liberate. A bird in a cage is not free, it has no liberty. Opening the cage door liberates the bird. Freedom is understood as either having the ability to act or change without constraint, or possessing the power and resources to fulfill one's purposes unhindered. When man is free, he is free through the positive power to assert his true individuality. Thus, each man must be given social scope for the vital manifestation of his being. This sort of freedom requires society at large to consciously reorganize its social and economic life in order to promote the personal development of each individual. This means society provides the circumstantial preconditions for the individual to realize himself. The self-realization of the individual was the highest goal of true freedom. Freedom is often associated with liberty and autonomy in the sense of giving oneself one's own laws, and with having rights and the civil liberties with which to exercise them without undue interference by the state. Frequently discussed kinds of political freedom include freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of choice, and freedom of speech. In one definition, something is free if it can change easily and is not constrained in its present state. Physicists and chemists may use the word in this sense. 1. Philosophy and religion sometimes associate freedom with free will, without undue or unjust constraints on that will, such as enslavement. It is an idea closely tied to the concept of negative liberty. Two concepts of liberty, positive and negative theories of freedom, are two such conceptions of political freedom. Negative liberty is a concept that is often used in political philosophy. It is the idea that freedom means an ability to do what one wants without external obstacles. This concept has been called too simplistic for discounting the importance of individual self-realization. Positive liberty is the ability to fulfill one's purposes. In its origin, the English word freedom relates etymologically to the word friend. In political discourse, political freedom is often associated with liberty and autonomy in the sense of giving oneself their own laws, and with having rights and the civil liberties to exercise them without interference by the state. Frequently discussed kinds of political freedom include freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of choice, and freedom of speech. In some occasions, particularly when discussion is limited to political freedoms, the terms freedom and liberty tend to be used interchangeably. Elsewhere, subtle distinctions between freedom and liberty are noted, that liberty differentiated from freedom in that freedom is primarily, if not exclusively, the ability to do as one will and what one has the power to do, whereas liberty concerns the absence of arbitrary restraints and takes into account the rights of all involved. As such, the exercise of liberty is subject to capability and limited by the rights of others. Liberty is linked to human subjectivity, freedom is not. The Declaration of Independence, for example, describes men as having liberty and the nation as being free. The free will of the quality of being free from the control of fate or necessity may first have been attributed to human will. Freedom differs from liberty as control differs from discipline. Liberty, like discipline, is linked to institutions and political parties, whether liberal or libertarian. Freedom is not. Although freedom can work for or against institutions, it is not bound to them. It travels through unofficial networks. To have liberty is to be liberated from something. To be free is to be self-determining and autonomous. Freedom can or cannot exist within a state of liberty. One can be liberated yet unfree, or free yet enslaved. Another distinction that some political theorists have deemed important is that people may aspire to have freedom from limiting forces, such as freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom from discrimination. But descriptions of freedom and liberty generally do not invoke having liberty from anything. On the contrary, the concept of negative liberty refers to the liberty one person may have to restrict the rights of others. The idea of freedom is the human dignity. Human dignity is a powerful phrase invoked to peacefully protest against violence, discrimination, and authoritarianism. But when we talk about human dignity, what do we mean? Human dignity is the inherent worth of each individual human being. Recognizing human dignity means respecting the special value of human beings that sets us apart from other animals, a value that is intrinsic and cannot be lost. Liberalism is the broad political philosophy that organizes society around liberty, justice, and equality, and is rooted in the idea of human dignity. Liberalism assumes each of our lives, plans, and preferences have some unimpeachable value, not because of any objective evaluation or contribution to a greater good, but simply because they belong to a human being. We are human, and therefore deserving of a baseline level of respect. Because so many of us take human dignity for granted fact of the humanness only when someone's dignity is ignored or violated that we feel compelled to talk about it. But human dignity means more than the absence of violence, discrimination, and authoritarianism. It means giving individuals the freedom to pursue their own happiness and purpose of freedom that can be hampered by restrictive social institutions or the tyranny of the majority. The liberal ideal of a good society is not just peaceful but also pluralistic. It is a society in which we respect others' right to think and live differently than we do. The freedom with which humans use their talents, noting that men are the inventors of innumerable arts, which they practice according to their own decision. 2. The purpose and values of freedom. The value of freedom is that it gives more power to the individual. The individual is liberated from any form of coercion or oppression from the government. The individual is therefore free to live their life on their own terms and as they wish. This leads to a more prosperous society in the long run. Freedom in regard to human progress. Freedom is the most important ingredient in regards to creating a wealthy, prosperous, healthy, educated, philanthropic, and diverse society. What is freedom? Where do the dominant definitions of freedom come from? How can we create a more free society? Freedom has historically been defined according to the interests of the ruling class in society. The dominant ideology is the ideology of the dominant class. The interests of the dominant class may peek through in the dominant ideology, more or less depending on how powerful or weak said class is respectively. Regardless, the prevailing ideology, when taken as a whole, will reflect the interests of the ruling class. In feudal society, this ruling class was the aristocracy. The dominant ideology of the time stressed the divinity of the church, an institution that lent legitimacy to the monarchy, through the concept of the divine right of kings, and by extension the aristocracy. While some Christian concepts of charity peeked through, reflecting minor concessions to the oppressed peasantry, they were recuperated by the feudal system to maintain complacency in it. In modern capitalist society, the bourgeoisie, those who own the means of production, those whose incomes come from profit, interest, and rent rather than the sale of their labor, are the ruling class. Thus, the dominant ideology reflects their interests. While certain ideas, such as voluntary community service, reflect something of concessions to proletarian needs, they are recuperated by capitalist society, just as charity was recuperated by the feudal system. Since the dominant ideology of today is the ideology of the bourgeoisie, the manner in which today's society defines freedom reflects bourgeois definitions of freedom: freedom from excess regulation, freedom of consumer choice, freedom from unfair economic developments, perhaps in the form of the organized proletariat. Historically, the definitions that liberal bourgeois philosophers and political figures have given for freedom reflect these interests. From those representing the ideology of social liberalism to those representing neoconservatism, the definitions of freedom hold commonalities reflecting the influence of this bourgeois system. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others. This idea, in and of itself, does not necessarily seem to be particularly harmful. Yes, to allow people to do what they will, as long as they do not encroach on the freedom of others, is a step toward a healthy society. But taken on its own, it creates a very antisocial and individualistic perception of freedom. To one who only adopts this idea alone, as right libertarians tend to do, freedom is freedom from society, freedom from the community. This definition alone serves to turn the individual into an antagonistic atom in opposition to the community. It rejects the collective in favor of the individual. It is also meaningless when the vast majority of people lack the basic means of survival and have no ability to even exercise their freedom. Capitalism's base contradiction between socialized production and private appropriation ensures that such reform is doomed to fail, therefore rendering his principle unworkable in bourgeois society. Further, modern liberals and right libertarians who follow this principle tend to ignore the need for this principle for a social base in order for it to hold any relevance to the vast majority of people. Due to liberalism's tendency to analyze all situations on the basis of individual choice, failing to consider social factors in people's preferences, actions, or the consequences of either, an application of these which only considers the individual is bound to end up harmful. For example, most liberals do not care that the bourgeoisie must necessarily extract surplus value a proletarian creates beyond the value of their wages, in order to have an income or to increase their capital. They do not see this as violating the freedom of another. Many definitions or applications of freedom are nebulous, arbitrary, subjective, or entirely abstract. Bourgeois freedom perceives law as the basis of freedom and thinks anything legislated must necessarily be made instantly true. They fail to see how their definitions of freedom fail. Even freedom of speech of the press fails to benefit the proletariat in this bourgeois society. Major media outlets dominate the information which the public consumes and are owned by the bourgeoisie. Over time, as a society becomes more free, we can expect to see higher rates of human prosperity. Freedom and democracy are directly tied together. You cannot have true freedom without democracy, and you cannot have true democracy without freedom. A free, fair democracy is paramount to human prosperity. One of the main values of freedom is that it brings with it the fruits of a free and fair democratic society. Democracy is an important political structure as it ensures the individual has the freedom to be heard and the ability to contribute to their society. Democracy directly reflects the values, beliefs, and ideologies of the people of which it serves. A free society is one where there is a diversity of viewpoints, beliefs, values, and ideologies. These all contribute to that society's democracy and ensure all people's voices are heard. The most important link between democracy and freedom is that there must be a system that is used to maintain freedom and personal liberty within a society. That system is democracy. Freedom has to be absolute and therefore has to be protected at all costs. Democracy does the best job at this. A system by the people and for the people. Democracy inherently reduces the risk of tyranny and extreme authoritarianism within a society. This in turn protects freedom and personal liberty. An amazing value freedom produces is the importance of personal responsibility. Many definitions or applications of freedom are nebulous, arbitrary, subjective, or entirely abstract. Bourgeois freedom perceives law as the basis of freedom and thinks anything legislated must necessarily be made instantly true. They fail to see how their definitions of freedom fail. Even freedom of speech of the press fails to benefit the proletariat in this bourgeois society. Major media outlets dominate the information which the public consumes and are owned by the bourgeoisie. The truth is that Marxism examined the objective, material reality and conditions, then produced theory and practice from that investigation. It is not born out of ideals, but material analysis. Marx did not come to his definition of freedom from his personal feelings or interests, like the bourgeoisie idealists, but from an analysis of historical trends, material reality, and class interests. The socialist definition of freedom, proletarian freedom, will prevail. Why? Because the contradictions of capitalism and its socialized character provide the seed of the future socialist society. When the proletariat becomes the dominant class in the place of the bourgeoisie, the proletarian definition of freedom, the definition that truly succeeds in application, will become the dominant idea. Freedom is the main factor in regard to human progress. There is a direct correlation between personal freedom and human prosperity. The freer a society is, the more productive its economy will be and the better educated the people will be. This leads to more prosperity, better health outcomes, better life expectancy, and a better standard of living. Freedom and democracy go hand in hand. Freedom brings with it the benefit of a free and fair democratic society. Democracy allows for the freedom of its people to be protected from any tyranny. This is a crucial component in ensuring freedom is absolute and the individual is protected from any form of corruption. Freedom brings with it the value of personal responsibility. In a free society, the individual bears more responsibility as they are held accountable and have to pay attention to the outcomes of potential decisions. Personal responsibility is an important trait in bettering the individual and adding value to society as a whole. People have the right to find information among one another, as is human nature. People cannot live without the need to give and be given ideas, assistance, and all the things they need in life as necessary. People are in need of democratic peace, political science, the proposition that democratic states never, or almost never, wage war on one another. The concept of democratic peace must be distinguished from the claim that democracies are in general more peaceful than non-democratic countries. Whereas the latter claim is controversial, the claim that democratic states do not fight each other is widely regarded as true by scholars and practitioners of international relations. The term democratic peace or liberal peace has demonstrated that, although interstate war is a rare event in general, wars between democracies have been even rarer. In the debate over international relations theory, democratic peace is identified with the liberal perspective, and it is closely associated with two other liberal claims about world politics: that international peace is promoted by A. Economic interdependence between states, and B. International institutions. For realists, so long as the international system is anarchic, violence will remain latent, if not always overt, in world politics regardless of the internal characteristics of individual states, aid their regime type. Thus, to the extent that the realists of peace indeed prevail as the leading theory of international relations and true freedom relations. Chapter 10. Basic Laws of Dialectical Materialism.
然后念呢，跟这里呢。